The Supremes are going to decide whether they will dominate the social scene or whether they're going to leave it to the electorate to decide the future of marriage.
Well, the court is going to hear 2 cases on same-sex marriage, and the rulings could bring some surprising consequences. John Jessup has the story from Washington.
The first case is a challenge to California's 2008 voter-approved ballot measure known as Proposition 8. It defines marriage as between a man and a woman and effectively bans gay marriage. The second looks at the Defense of Marriage Act, which only recognizes marriages as the union of one man and woman under federal law.
I'd probably just put it right there.
For Jessica Chipoco and Lindsay Dawson, the Supreme Court hearings are personal. They're getting legally married this weekend in Maryland, and they already foresee challenges.
Okay, so on this tax return, I'm married. On this tax return, I'm single. Well, we're going to do it joint, at the state level. We'd just be like on the same page as we are in the state that we live in. If the federal government can, extend that same right to us.
But both say they're hopeful.
And I just think it's incredibly moving. I think it's a really exciting time, personally, because I'm excited to marry Jessica. But it's exciting in that you can feel the country shifting.
And the public is moving in their direction. Polls show most Americans now approve of same-sex marriage, with younger people supporting it and older people opposed.
So we see strong divisions among older Democrats and older Republicans, but when we look at millennials, that's Americans under the age of 30, we actually see the partisan differences diminishing.
Still, some conservatives, like Ryan Anderson, are trying to turn the tide. Co-author of the book, What is Marriage?, Anderson filed a friend of the court brief defending traditional marriage, arguing that marriage is already in crisis, threatening society, kids, and the family unit.
Same-sex attracted Americans are not to blame for the problem that we face in America right now. But the question we have to ask is, do we want to double down on the mistakes of the past 40 years? Or do we want to start recovering a more sound understanding of what marriage is and why it matters?
Anderson and others worry that legalizing same-sex marriage could have serious consequences, like redefining marriage altogether and possibly leading to polygamy or even group marriages with multiple partners. Also, same-sex marriage could hurt religious freedoms if churches, religious organizations, and businesses have to support whatever the government defines as a marriage or possibly face government action. But Anderson believes there's hope for supporters of traditional marriage. Just as the pro-life movement made its case for years and changed public opinion, Anderson believes marriage supporters can do the same, with young people understanding the value of the traditional family as they grow older.
40 years later, my generation is now more pro-life than my parents' generation. And the same thing is true with the marriage. We're just starting this discussion about marriage.
These cases have the potential to settle the issue once and for all. Supporters of same-sex marriage hope the justices will rule in favor of equality and halt the debate, while opponents say whatever the decision, they've only just begun their defense. John Jessup, CBN News, the Supreme Court.
I hope the justices are reserved in their judgment. Roe versus Wade was a disaster. It was a legal abortion, if I can use that term that was used by another commentator, had no basis in tradition or law. It was made up by the judges. And we've had a divide, a fight, a squabble throughout our nation ever since Roe versus Wade. And over 50 million abortions have been performed, but in a sense, how did that help anybody? But they suddenly declared it a constitutional right to be able to abort your child, that you could murder an unborn child, and that was a constitutional right. Now the question is it going to be decreed by 5 judges that homosexual marriage is a constitutional right? Wouldn't it be better to let this be worked out in the states, state by state, legislature by legislature, voter by voter? And after a while, a consensus comes about, and if the nation decides that's it, then of course people will go along with it, and then they can also be able to change it. But once it's, quote, enshrined in the Constitution, then it's a different matter. So again, I hope and pray that the judges will say, look, Let's leave this thing to the people to decide. But I understand there are about 2,000 different federal programs that depend on marriage, the definition of marriage. That's why that Defense of Marriage Act was passed, to define what a marriage is. Because there are all kinds of benefits, all kinds of privileges, all kinds of rights, all kinds of responsibilities that attach to marriage. Well, there appears to be no end to the ways the government can waste your taxpayer dollars. And now, here's another example. Lee Webb has that story. Lee.
Pat, the Internal Revenue Service is apologizing to taxpayers for wasting money on a video parody of Star Trek. IRS employees made the 6-minute video in-house for about $60,000. All it's earned, though, is a rebuke from Congress. Acting Commissioner Stephen Miller says the video was made 3 years ago for training purposes, but critics say it does not have any training value whatsoever.
Back in Russia, I dreamed someday I'd be rich and famous.
Me too. That's why I became a public servant.
Miller says training procedures have changed in recent years and that the video would not be made today. Pat?
Well, it's shocking what they're spending money. They brought out something, I think Senator Coburn brought out something else that was on the news yesterday about they're studying ducks to see whether ducks can breed and what it takes for a male duck to perform sex acts. And it's going to cost us $300,000 or $400,000 to find out. I mean, how nutty can you get? You're supposed to be in trouble. But now here's the deal. The Republicans have brought initiative after initiative after initiative to soften the effect of the sequester. Something to open the federal parks, something to permit tours of the White House, something to beef up Homeland Security, all the way across the board. And in every single case, the Democrats have voted them down. Why? Because they want this sequester to hurt, and then they'll come back and say, see what those Republicans did to you. This is horrible. What about America? What's good for America? Shouldn't we have access to the federal parks? And if there are people in Congress who are willing to change that sequester to make it a little bit easier, or to slide some money from one pocket to another, why not? No, no, no. The Democrats don't want that. And Harry Reid in the Senate refuses to bring those things up to a vote. You talk about horrible. Why don't somebody, or why doesn't somebody start screaming to say, what is wrong with you guys? Well, there's a hue and cry going out from some oligarchs who've got big bucks in Cyprus banks that are now going to get confiscated, or at least shifted into some kind of a equity interest in the banks. And Lee has more about what other governments may be thinking about doing to raid private bank accounts.
And I believe there's a cautionary tale for us as Americans here in this next story, Pat. Governments may raid savings accounts in Spain, Italy, and other nations in order to save the euro. That's already happening, of course, in Cyprus. The government there plans to take money out of savings accounts to help save that country's banking system. And the Dutch chairman of the Eurozone says that could serve as a model for other countries. The London Telegraph reporting that he believes the success of the move in Cyprus shows that it can be done elsewhere. North Korea is readying its military for potential strikes on U.S. bases. It's calling for all strategic rocket and long-range artillery to be prepared to strike U.S. bases on Guam, Hawaii, and mainland America, as well as South Korea. It's just the latest in a series of threats from Pyongyang. Recently, North Korea said it would launch a nuclear attack against the U.S. and South Korea because of sanctions against its nuclear program. Where do you think this is headed, Pat?
Well, it's a lot of bluster, and I suppose as a great nation, we've got to grin and bear it and let them bluster. But I remember the words of Kurt LeMay, who was head of Strategic Air Command. Speaking of Vietnam, he said we ought to bomb them back into the Stone Age. And I think somehow we ought to pass the word to Mr. Yoon that if they so much as lift a finger against the United States and one bullet comes across the border against one of our servicemen, we will flatten Pyongyang. And I think it's time they begin to realize that they're a little pipsqueak nation, you know, that just has a couple of nukes and they're making a lot of noise. But they like to do that, and they've held their people in bondage. It is the most awful, despicable misuse of humanity that takes place in North Korea. But instead of looking after the people and feeding them, they feed the military, and they feed them propaganda as well. Lee?
Pat, the U.S. is arming some of the Syrian rebels who are fighting to bring down that government. Now some of those same groups could be a threat to invade Israel. Chris Mitchell has that story.
2 years of Syrian civil war have killed 70,000. Now fighting threatens to spill over into surrounding countries, including Israel.
Syria is deteriorating from any point of view. The organs of the regime are totally dysfunctional, and the large areas are today a prey for all the militias.
While the West agrees Assad's Iranian and Shiite-backed regime must go, the Sunni-backed opposition and jihadis could be just as bad.
Both are vicious, both are abusing human rights, both are abusing women, because this is the culture of the Middle East.
The fighting within Syria has reached all the way to Israel's borders. Below this ridge, the Syrian army and rebel forces have been fighting for control over this village. Just over the hill is Moshav Alonei Habashan. Amir Duvdivani teaches therapeutic horseback riding here. It's Israel's closest community to Syria, only about a half a mile from the border.
We hear bombs, we hear snipers, we hear them all the time. 2 times the chefs fell in the Moshav, but actually the life is going on. We have to continue.
Recently, rebel forces kidnapped 21 UN peacekeepers, holding them 3 days in this village. While they were released unharmed, their 40-year mission here is in shambles. Several countries have withdrawn their troops, and others may follow, potentially leaving a dangerous area in chaos. Jihadis released this internet video blaming Assad and his father before him for not firing a single shot on the Golan Heights in 40 years. But Middle East expert Dr. Mordecai Kadar says that's not all.
After they take care of Assad in Syria, they will go to take out Nasrallah from his hole in the ground and to kill him. And this will be on their way to Jerusalem, to liberate Jerusalem from the Zionists, from the Jews.
The Golan Heights sits just 40 miles from Damascus. Israel took the strategic plateau during the 1967 Six-Day War, and it's been Israel's quietest border for nearly 4 decades. But resident Hen Mordecai, a veteran of 3 Israeli wars, says that could be changing.
They'll infiltrate. They'll carry out a terror attack. It's a question of time, because there's no leader, there's no authority, no law there. Everyone is doing what's in his own head.
So while Israel wants to maintain quiet on the border, the chaos in Syria forces Israel to be ready for war. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Golan Heights.
And back here at home, it seems like Old Man Winter just won't quit, with still another major storm system hitting the Midwest and East Coast. But apparently it's finally expected to taper off today. Heather Sells has that story.
It started in the Midwest with near whiteout conditions in Indiana and Illinois. And in St. Louis, 12.4 inches, the most recorded snowfall on a March day ever. Now families across the region are beginning to dig out.
It's hard to believe it's the end of March, but I actually love it.
I'm ready for it to quit.
After the Midwest, the storm headed east, creating icy conditions on the roads from Pennsylvania to New York and also in Virginia and Washington, D.C. In many places, havoc and a different kind of spring break.
More like winter break.
For those of you that trusted the groundhog, boy, he blew it, didn't he? And while we are getting some heavy wet snow across the Northeast, many locations will not be getting over 6 inches.
In central Florida, weather of another kind. A system bringing 80-mile-per-hour winds ripped the roofs off buildings and burst through the doors of this Lowe's store.
It was a bad windstorm. It was the worst I've ever seen.
The winds have left fallen trees strewn across yards and even homes, making for a major cleanup day today. Heather Sells, CBN News.
Well, the more friends you have, the longer you're likely to live. A new study out of the UK finds social isolation increases the risk of early death in older people. The study looked at 6,500 folks over the age of 52. Researchers found that seniors who were not able to see friends or family regularly are 50% more likely to die prematurely. They say getting out and being around other people helps with feelings of loneliness, and it will actually help increase life expectancy. Pat, it looks like there's a biblical principle here at work, that man was made for fellowship with God as well as other people.
Amen. Well, I'm sitting next to a lovely lady here who decides she wants to live to 100 because she's got so many children. Such a big family.
I can't afford to die.
Keep on adopting so you make sure you live longer. Each 3 or 4 more kids.
Well, I think there is a lot of truth to that, though.
Yeah,
that we
sure.
really do, gain some just socialization skills and good health, mental stimulation from all of that.
Exactly.
So good news.
Well,
Good news.
it's
Make
good
friends.
news.
Make friends.
Make friends and adopt kids from the Ukraine. Lots and lots of them.
Oh, I'm for that.
Okay.
President Obama marked the first night of Passover with a Seder dinner at the White House. It's a tradition Mr. Obama started with some of his Jewish staffers on the campaign trail in 2008. The Seder, of course, begins Passover when Jews celebrate being freed from slavery in ancient Egypt. During his trip to Israel last week, the president said he continues to hold the Seder so his daughters can experience it. Egypt's top prosecutor has issued arrest warrants now for 5 prominent activists who oppose the Muslim Brotherhood. Egyptian rights activists and the opposition warn the move could be the start of an intimidation campaign. A spokesman for the opposition says they feel threatened and expect the worst. The opposition charges that Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood have failed to take on Egypt's most difficult problems and are simply trying to gain a monopoly on power. You can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com.